Happy Loving Day. This day in 1967, the Supreme Court decided that interracial marriage was okay in the case Virginia versus Loving. Partly decided on the principle of the right to privacy, which the leaked Supreme Court ruling on abortion will say does no longer exist. So not only we lose the right to abortion, we might lose the right to gay marriage, and my marriage might become illegal. These are the times that we live in. Unitarian Universalism has a history of high ideals. And being human, we have a history of not living up to our ideals. There's no shame in failure if we admit our mistakes and try again. I have a European heritage and my wife has African heritage. In 1992, we had a son and we named him Benjamin, after two founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Franklin, who was a Unitarian, and Benjamin Rush, who was a Universalist. In 1776, that same year in Philadelphia, they formed one of the first anti-slavery societies in America. Now, we considered other names. Gail liked the name Jefferson. I admired Jefferson for writing the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom. However, we thought it might be problematic to name our black son Jefferson Davis, since that was the president of the Confederacy. Plus, Jefferson had slaves, and that was problematic also. The symbolism of naming our son after two abolitionists seemed more apt. But this past month I discovered, thanks to a PBS special, that Benjamin Franklin also had slaves. Since he was not a plantation owner, I didn't even consider the possibility. But according to the Benjamin Franklin Historical Society, Franklin owned slaves as early as 1735 and until 1781, 5 years after he formed the Anti-Slavery Society. The Franklin household had 6 slaves: Peter, his wife Jemima, their son Othello, George, John, and King. On February 3rd, 1790, less than 3 months before his death, Franklin petitioned Congress to provide the means to bringing slavery to an end. This went nowhere in the Congress. I'm sad to say that learn that Ben Franklin had been so wrong, but I do admire him from trying to learn from his mistakes. In the mid-19th century, Unitarians were involved in abolitionism. The most famous was Theodore Parker, and he harbored runaway slaves at his church. Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, was paraphrasing Theodore Parker when he spoke of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And Martin Luther King was paraphrasing Parker when he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." We championed the forward thinking of Parker. He fought against the Fugitive Slave Act, and he harbored fugitives. But according to Jim Kelly, in an article in the Paradox magazine, he called it "The Paradox of Theodore Parker: Transcendentalist, Abolitionist, Abolitionist, and White Supremacist." Parker kind of held the view of his day of the superior of the Anglo-Saxon race. And he also talked about how other races, and that's the thing about racism, it gets defined differently in different generations, because he considered the Celts, the Irish, who were starting to invade Boston, and Africans as lesser races to the Anglo-Saxon race. And furthermore, even though Parker was a hero and an abolitionist and trying to get rid of slavery, he was an outcast among the Unitarian ministers of his day. Because they said, you're breaking the fugitive slave law. If we disobey the law, society will break down. And also, Boston was a shipping town. And although there wasn't much slavery in Boston at the time, in fact, they had been made illegal by that time, there was still an awful lot of money being made by people who had boats that carried slaves to the New World. And those people with money funded churches. The Unitarians and the Universalists merged in 1961, and this began a decade of strong stands on civil rights. We marched with Dr. King. Loyola Liuzzo and James Reeb were martyred in Selma. But it all came crashing down in the 60s. In 1968, the UUA at General Assembly voted to give $1 million to the Black Affairs Council. Now, some UUs felt that the Black Affairs Council, the BAC, was a separatist black power group. And they formed Black and White Action to promote a more gentle form of integration. And it was sort of like the Martin Luther King and Malcolm X debate within the black community of what is the best method to get to the same goal. In 1969, at GA, Bowo requested funding and was refused. And this was a controversial thing. It included walkouts and shoving and people stealing microphones so they could no longer have any debate. It was not our finest moment of being calm and reasonable and intellectual. And then in 1970, it turned out that the UA did not have as much money as they thought they did. And so they voted to reduce the funding of the Black Action Council, which was not well received. And by April, the Black Affairs Council disaffiliated with the UUA and boycotted General Assembly, which then voted not to restore funding. You can read more about this in the timeline of Black Environment Controversy by Mark Morrison Reed. There are many hurt feelings in this controversy. Many African Americans and some whites left the association, which made UUs very shy about ever talking about racism again. Meanwhile, at the same time, during the 70s and early 80s, there were many advances in the inclusion of women and the LGBTQ population. I became a minister, I became a member of UU about 1985 and a minister in 1995. And during that time, the UUA has started to address race again through the Journey Towards Wholeness program. In addressing racism that exists in these institutions and systems, including the Unitarian Universalist Association, its districts, its congregations, many programs at our General Assemblies from 1992 until 1997 addressed these issues. And members of congregations across the continent discuss how racism operates in our congregations and communities. A report developed over 5 years by the UUA Racial and Cultural Diversity Task Force entitled Journey Towards Wholeness. The report affirmed our goals of racial equality. But after 20 years, we still struggle with race. In 2017, the UUA president resigned because of a hiring controversy. We wanted to hire people in our districts, in our regional staff, that wanted our regional staffs to be diverse. But some of our regions, like the Midwest and the Prairie, are not so diverse, and it's hard to find enough candidates. So it was agreed, since we were starting to do things online anyway, that candidates could be taken from other regions and represent a region. So like somebody from Montana could be in the southern region because most of the work is done online anyway. And if you had a person of color from another region, then you might be able to hire them to work in a region from a distance. Okay, the first time that this rule was applied was to hire a white guy from Arizona when there was a person of color candidate in the southern region. So, said, whoops, and controversy exploded. And our first Hispanic president resigned because of the controversy of this thing. When we make special provisions to make it easier for us to recruit people of color, and then the first time we apply it, we get a good white guy, there was a problem. And in the wake of his resignation, the Leadership Council made this statement: we take very seriously the question of how our policies, practices, leadership, and culture systematically center and advantage white people within Unitarian Universalism. We acknowledge that it's past time for us to examine more deeply than ever the patterns of our institutional racism that are embedded in our practice of leadership, including hiring. It reminds me of a song by Elvis Costello, when the lyric says, "The teacher never taught you anything but white lies, but you never see the lies that you believe in." And that's kind of where we are as a group. If we ask anybody directly, do you hold personal prejudice? They say, of course not. Of course not. But then there's all these things in our lives that we just think are normal, that we don't realize are normal because they were put in place years ago by white supremacy. Think of the housing pattern in any city that still exists. It isn't there just because that happened to be. It's there because it was direct public policy. So that's some of the controversy that has led the denomination to where we are now. And currently there are two processes that are addressing the controversy. The 8th Principle Project and the Article 2 Study Commission. Now, Article 2 is the part of our bylaws that include the 7 principles and the 6 sources. It's the kind of introduction to who we are as a faith group. Paula Cole-Jones is co-author of the 8th Principle and also on the Article 2 Commission. And she assured me in a recent UU Justice NC Zoom meeting that the two processes are complementary and not in opposition. And I needed this reassurance. This 8th Principle controversy has been bubbling for several years now under the radar. I didn't know how to preach on it, so I hadn't preached on it. The eighth principle was proposed in 2017 to specifically address racism with our faith in the world. And there was debate about how it sounds different than the other 7 principles that are more broad and generalized. And the Article 2 Commission was established to look at all the principles and sources. And it felt to me that there was people who were urgently bringing a specific need, and this was being co-opted and absorbed through procedural issues and saying, well, it's 40 years, and we said in 1985 that in 40 years we'd be re-looking at our Article 2 again anyway, and so let's just kind of mix this all into the mix, and I thought that the specific issue would get lost. I fear we were back in those battles of 1968, where you had empowerment versus integration. People who wanted to act now, and people who said, we need to think before we do anything. And that's always in tension of trying to meet the urgent need, yet also not go off in some odd direction. But after talking to Paula Cole-Jones, I likened it to how we in New Bern in Eastern Carolina respond to a hurricane. You know, the roof comes off and it's leaking and it needs to be patched right away. But in addition, we need to engage in a longer process and figure out why the roof failed and how we should build back in the future and how we should prepare and be ready for the next hurricane, because the next hurricane is coming. So the eighth principle addresses the immediate need, and the Article 2 Commission is the long-term plan. The eighth principle reads as follows: we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote. And that's the same language that precedes all our 7 principles. To affirm and promote, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Now, some argue that the eighth principle is redundant. Our first principle affirms the inherent worth and dignity. The second, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And the sixth, peace, liberty, and justice for all. But the eighth principle is different. It calls for actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions. Instead of facing outward and telling the world how it should be, it points inward and tells us to get our house in order. And another concern is that it highlights racism at the expense of other oppressions, like sexism and homophobia. And this is true. But I think it's necessary to do this because in fighting the oppression of racism is where we as a denomination has been least successful. We have voted on the right side of this issue for 200 years. But still, you go around from place to place in the city, our congregations remain mostly white. And even in a town like us, where 60% of the African American population is unchurched, the unchurched, the disaffected by church, are our people. That's how most of the white folks got here. You know, so the fields are ripe, but we just have not figured out a way to make ourselves more welcoming. So I like the eighth principle because it's important to begin somewhere. And race is an important place to begin because it compounds all other problems. Sexism marginalizes all women, but women of color are marginalized more. Classism creates poverty, but racism restricts poor people of color to ghettos, barrios, and reservations. Transphobia marginalizes the gender fluid, but trans people of color are the most likely to die as murder victims. Nationalism results in war, but non-white nations are exploited and desecrated by our government. Bob Marley sang in a song called War, quoting Haile Selassie, "Until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, everywhere is war." So I encourage this congregation to consider the eighth principle. Is this something this congregation needs? It can be a step to hold ourselves accountable and stop ignoring the white supremacy that has infected the world, the white supremacy that has founded this nation with stolen labor and stolen land, with inequities that have been passed down from generation to generation. White supremacy cannot help but be a part of our congregations because we are part of the culture. But I caution to not pass the eighth principle because the minister gives a flamboyant speech and gins up enough support so he can win a 60-40 vote and we can make a fashionable proclamation, because I think we need to have a more serious conversation than that. And UUs are good at getting the concept. They think that if they get the words and ideas right and wordsmith something, that's the be-all and end-all of all life. But I wouldn't want this congregation to vote for words unless you're willing to begin the work. Because I don't want us to be like my psychology professor in college. He and his wife both had PhDs in psychology. She was having a baby, and they went to natural childbirth classes, and they understood the concept, and the teacher says, "You're not going to do well." And they said, "Well, this is easy." And I said, "Yeah, but you are intellectuals. You are not going to practice breathing for 8 months. You'll say, 'I got the concept, and here it goes.'" And that was exactly right. They say, "I got the concept," and birth came, and it was like they were wholly unprepared, even though they understood the concept probably better than anybody else in the class. But because they were intellectuals, they didn't do the day-to-day work and exercise necessary. And that's what we need to do as a congregation. Because we know what the right thing to say is. But we're still struggling about how to actually do it in a consistent manner. To help the congregations of North Carolina examine the eighth principle, the UU Justice NC is planning to hold Zoom seminars later this year. And I found out this week that I'm on that committee. I didn't step back fast enough. Along with a friend of mine from the Winston-Salem congregation who will be much more forceful on this issue than me because he's much more forceful on anything as me. and another person who I've yet to meet. And so we're going to have our first meeting sometime next week. And it'll be an idea of how do we get people to have the discussion, to really look at this hard issue. And there seems to be interest. In April, 80 UUs from 18 North Carolina congregations Zoomed with Paula Cole Jones to talk about the eighth principle. And as of March of this past year, 155 UU congregations out of about 1,000 have voted to adopt. And I haven't heard the most recent numbers. They'll probably be announced at General Assembly, but it's probably over 200 at this time. It's an important decision, and it must be weighed carefully. One of the criticisms of the eighth principle is that it just doesn't sound like the other seven. You heard me read the paragraph. It was a little bit longer, and it didn't stick in the mind, at least to me. And it encourages activism rather than contemplation. But perhaps this is not a problem with the eighth principle, but it's a problem with the other seven. The 7 principles and 6 sources were adopted in 1985, just a mere 20 years after the merger of Unitarian and Universalism. And there was a need to say who we were at the time, trying to figure out what the heck is this? And so the 7 principles tend to be identity statements. And that was what we needed at the time. But written into it was that these need to be reviewed generation by generation. They were never meant to be a creed, an unchangeable truth that binds us forever. The 7 principles and 6 sources of our faith were and are provisional, and they evolve as we as a group evolve. The Article 2 Study Commission was designated by the UUA and it's expected to report the issue in 2023. This year at General Assembly in June, there will be meetings to gather opinions about who UUs are and who they ought to be. And on the table in the foyer at Qatar, I ask you to pick up one of these. It's a thing about General Assembly. I'm going to be attending General Assembly, not in Portland, but here in this sanctuary. So I will be attending the various different programs and principles where these things will be talked about and debated in depth. And you're free to come here and watch. Just drop in anytime. This is the schedule. And I hope to see some of you here, and we'll have a little watch party of what our congregation is doing. As a congregation, we are permitted 3 delegates. We have 2, Margaret Tao and Mike Core have agreed to be delegates. If anybody wants to be a delegate, that please talk to me afterwards. It involves voting on some of the issues that come before. The big vote is board members. And there are 2 contested seats, and I know one of the candidates personally, and these are people who have said things like, well, if the younger people of color want to have this denomination, I'm willing to help support them form a separate one, but please don't change our honored traditions of UU. And I can hear her saying that.
So can I.
And so it's important, who we elect. If we elect people who really are serious about doing the work. This denomination, this faith, this philosophy of Unitarian Universalism needs you. It's not a top-down institution. We govern our own congregations. So any congregation can pass the 8th Amendment as saying, or 8th principle as saying, this is what we do here. And it doesn't need approval of a bishop or the General Assembly. But we also join with other congregations to say the direction of the movement as a whole. This is not an easy faith. It doesn't tell you what to believe or do. It only survives when individuals have conversations and then decide what is right and build consensus with one another. It's a possibility that neither of these things will get passage, and they might, because something better might come along. And even if they do get passed, 20 years from now we'll be looking back and saying, yeah, what we thought was a great idea still doesn't quite do it, and we need to do it again. Because we are a faith that does the best that we can in every generation, and then has the courage to look back and say, we can do better. It's uncertain what the exact form our movement will take, but now is the time to decide. This generation will build upon the past and make its mark. Be part of the process. Trust future generations to look back and correct our mistakes. Have courage to work for your ideals now. A beloved community cannot emerge unless we try. May we bless and be blessed.